Assalamu alaikum, everyone, and jazakumullah khairan for attending. Inshallah, we're going to speak about a different topic today, and that's tazkiyah. When we're talking about tazkiyah, the word tazkiyah and what that means, there's so many different angles to it. So, hopefully, inshallah, we'll be covering the different areas that we learn about tazkiyah. So, what is tazkiyah? Well, Al Ghazali, who is actually considered the most important figure to teach and speak about tazkiyah, and in fact, he probably has, along with Ibn al Jawzi and Ibn al Qayyim, probably have the most important books about tazkiyah, which is self-discipline. Or I could just probably the fast translation for the word tazkiyah is really that self discipline. But is that really what it's all about? Not quite. So let's just look into the different meanings of tazkiyah and what that means. Yeah, you'll see Arabi frequently, but inshallah I'll be translating it. So Al Ghazali actually says it tazkiyah is actually tarbiyah, or tazkiyah is actually discipline. And every single nation that is not disciplined or raised within that discipline, then there's actually no good in it, because then it doesn't actually it doesn't actually have the moral system to let it live principle, so then it lives towards its own desires, and that brings in chaos. So regardless of whatever system you've got, every single country has its own laws. All right. And of course, when we speak about laws, it's easier to probably speak about laws and just lay out that if you don't do such thing, or you do such thing, you will be fined, or you will probably be responsible for a certain ticket, or if you do such a thing, you will be rewarded. So in Islam, there are actually a number of different disciplines that we actually go back to in order to treat us on the inside and not just on the outside. And to tame those different desires or those wrong behaviors, that's why when we speak about tazkiyah, it's in order to bring about a discipline, not necessarily from the outside alone, but even from the inside. So the tazkiyah is actually an inner purity, and it's an inner discipline in order to bring about the behavior that is principled by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is actually the core of the ayah. قَدْ أَفْلَحَ مَنْ زَكَّاهَا. The ones to succeed are the ones to actually purify it. And when you actually look at the word tazkiyah, it actually comes from the root zakiyah, or within zaka, yazku, etc. So what is that? The word zakah actually means to increase or to purify. So how do you actually increase and purify? How do these two different words as an entity, how do they actually combine together? So when they combine together in where ilm yazku bil infaq, in order to obtain ilm and knowledge, you actually have to give it. You actually have to teach it. You have to sit in a certain setting in order to gain that. So to gain something, you have to actually work on giving up on something. So think of it this way: you have to give up on something in order to gain something, which is exactly like when we look at zakah. You give up on certain money in order to gain the love for Allah Almighty, in order to gain that connection between you and Allah Almighty Ar-Razzaq, in order to gain the love of spirituality. So you give up on money in order to gain love for Akhirah, love for the hereafter, love for Allah Almighty. So you give up on something. And that's what zakah really is. So when we speak about tazkiyah, you're giving up on a lot of different things that you desire in order to gain spirituality. So you're basically disciplining your inner self, or let me call it the animal side of ourselves, in order to gain the spiritual, or let me call it the angelic adab, or the angelic mannerism. anywhere you're giving up on the different materialistic things in order to gain a type of a connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's why when we actually look at tazkiyah as defined by Al Ghazali. Now, when I speak about Al Ghazali, it's really important to consider and remember that Al Ghazali, who died in 505 Hijriya, is probably one of the most important figures to speak about and to write on philosophy. Two, on tazkiyah, and three, he is actually Shafi'i madhab, so that has another perspective, but it's actually one of the most important figures throughout history. And Al Ghazali is actually considered one of the most important figures to write on discipline, tazkiyah, Sufism, and of course, Sufism is mysticism. All right. And he actually said that tazkiyah, he said, it's all about perfecting the nafs al-insaniya. Nafs al-insaniya is like the inner, the nafs, nafs is really our own selves, to perfect our souls. And the way to do it, they often use a very, I would say, a very strange one for those that know a lot about horseback riding, or you don't have to know a lot about it, you could know about it. I'm not the best in horseback riding, but when you actually look at horseback riding, you've got the rope and you've got the saddle, and then you let loose on the rope that you're basically holding on to it in order to let the animal keep going, which is the horse in this situation. And if you hold back on it, you pull it, the animal and the horse understands that you want it to stop. You basically train it, and with training, it starts to understand what you mean by the pull on the rope or by letting the rope loose. So they often actually compare it with horseback riding and how you treat the animal and how you train it. And that's why they use that comparison in order to help us how we deal with the different things with the different things that we desire. So he would actually always compare that, and he says that tazkiyah is actually a form of self-control, in where you're controlling one's desires from their motives to reach the highest level of principle and value. In other words, you're taking that control. It's all about making sure that your desires don't control you, but you actually control the desires. And the reason why you don't let the desires control you is because the desires will control you to an endless type of control, which will actually lead to your own basically to your own ending, to your own end, basically, and to your own chaos. Now, what are the things needed to cleanse from to obtain tazkiyah? Now, here's the thing, is that when we actually speak about fitna, it's a very common word that when we speak about fitna, it becomes, okay, what is fitna? So the word fitna actually has a number of different meanings. So when we're talking about fitna, we're talking about different trials. But sometimes the word trials doesn't really give the word the real meaning. And if you actually look at the word fitna in the Arabic language, initially, speaking about the etymology of it, it actually means to expose something, and just like you expose gold on fire in order to purify and separate the gold from the different elements that might be stones, that might be soil, and the different elements out there, in order to make sure that you're only getting pure gold and not the other elements that might actually be found on earth. But when we actually look at tazkiyah in the Quran, there are actually a number of different meanings. I'm just going to be translating it really, really quick here because I really didn't have time to write everything down in English. So fitna, which is really our goal in trying to gain tazkiyah, to gaining discipline, is that you are actually trying to win and achieve in in the test and the trials that might be surrounding you within your life? Is it that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala puts you in these trials, or are these trials actually part of what you will be living in? In other words, these trials actually act as one piece of a reality of the creation that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created, whether it's the things in the past, the things in the future, giving people free will and what they might actually do. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that the different trials out there were actually because you are centered around a test. In which is why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah Al-Ankabut, أَحَسِبَ النَّاسُ أَن يُتْرَكُوا أَن يَقُولُوا آمَنَّا وَهُمْ لَا يُفْتَنُونَ. Did people actually think that they can claim faith without being tested, that they really have faith? And the second thing that a fitna can mean is that something that keeps away from the right path. In other words, it becomes a negative energy, a negative force that will keep you away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And when you actually look at that, it becomes, whether it's an external negative force or an internal negative force. So what does it do? It basically starts taking you away from the right path, and it starts connecting you with a different form of desire, which is whether it's the inner desire or seeking more in dunya. And I'd like to focus on that one a little bit, inshallah, along the lines later on. So the other thing that we want to work on in attaining tazkiyah is keeping away from the torments of hellfire, and the torments not only from hellfire, but even the torments of this life. Are we staying away from the torments of this life? Well, absolutely. Because the second that you actually decide to take a wrong path, this wrong path will actually lead you to a wrong consequence in life. And what that means to a wrong consequence in life, in where it will actually affect you, it will affect you by taking you away from what is actually your own benefit, what is your own sake. And which is why Ibn al-Qayyim, I believe it was, he said, الشريعة مصلحة كلها. Sharia is all about benefit, is all centered around your sake. Now, the other thing that we're trying to do and gain by working on tazkiyah and inner or self-control and discipline is to abstain from shirk, associating partners with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or rejecting the words and orders of Allah Almighty. And the other thing that we're trying to keep out from, which is falling in sin and hypocrisy. Now, the other thing, of course, is that we're trying to stay away from the misunderstanding in Islam. And in other words, it becomes this confusion in many things. So how do we actually do that? We're going to talk about each and every single one of them. Of course, related to point number 6 is the point of delusion. Of course, delusion, misconceptions, and of course that eventually leads to a lot of let's say, contaminated vision, and the contaminated vision leads to a wrong discipline, a wrong behavior, and the wrong behavior, you surely then have lost any closeness or sincerity trying to attain closeness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, the other thing, it's really strange that when we're talking about fitna, it is actually correlated. The word fitna can also be interpreted to mental illness. Although, yes, the word is junoon, but it is also correlated with fitna to mean mental illness, but that doesn't mean that every mental illness is necessarily some form of, lacking discipline. So those are just really fast things, although that's not the only thing that we need to obtain, or we seek to obtain from tazkiyah. So what are the different types of tazkiyah? Well, in order to gain tazkiyah, you can't actually work on one thing. You actually have to work on two things. Well, just like we're talking about when we're speaking about body illnesses as well. So you can't just take medications, but you will also need to consider certain diets. In other words, you're going to leave certain things, avoid certain things, and you're going to work on increasing certain diets and certain nutritions to help you probably improve in your body. Maybe not all illnesses are like that, but when in terms of tazkiyah, that is actually the case, where you have to avoid certain matters in order to gain that spiritual that spirituality and spiritual elevation. You actually need to consider the spiritual denouncers and what are those, and abstain from a lot of the wrong disciplines that might actually put you on the wrong end, because those are actually stronger and a bigger force in controlling you towards the wrong direction. And it's a lot more important to abstain from the spiritual denouncers than actually work on the spiritual elevators. So, what are the spiritual denouncers? Things like when we're talking about sinning, or when we're talking about doing matters that are not, that are qaba'ih. So, what are qaba'ih? Qaba'ih are things that are detested, not necessarily by text, but also by the spirit of Islam. In other words, you could say that it's not part of the Islamic discipline. Now, the other thing that we do in tazkiyah is tahliya. What is here? Tahliya is basically the spiritual denouncers, and the tahliya are basically the spiritual elevators. So, what is a spiritual enhancer or a spiritual elevator? So, when you're doing and working on the spiritual elevators, you're beautifying the discipline. You're beautifying discipline by acquiring certain mannerisms to help you grow within that. So, whether you're talking about manners, or whether you're talking about new behaviors, or whether you're talking about new behaviors in order to reach in nafs al-mutma'inna. Now, what is a nafs al-mutma'inna? In nafs al-mutma'inna, there are actually different levels of nafs, different levels within yourself. Within yourself, your soul actually has your soul has different shades to it. There's the shade to give you life, but there's also the part that is related within yourself, because as a human being, we actually have certain things that we share with animals, which is, in order to consider life, we worry about security, we worry about food, we worry about life, and these things we relate it with our own survival. So with that, in order to consider survival, many times it pushes us towards a certain type of mannerism, because we correlate our survival with hanging on with a number of different items in this world in order to enhance and increase our quality of life, and therefore it makes us and drives us towards directions and towards certain areas that basically it feels like we are trying to somehow increase the quality of life, when in reality we're just letting our desires control us without us recognizing. So, what is tahliya supposed to be doing? Well, tahliya is living the principle, rather than letting your own drives, which is that animal drive that is within us, drive us towards feeling that we need to struggle for survival by containing the different things in dunya. So, which is why Al-Ghazali actually said that the core of tazkiyah or self-discipline is all about elevating oneself by taking it step after step, in other words, step at a time, from the bad mannerisms to the good mannerisms, and then taking it in that gradual elevation to reaching a level of purity, a level of Safa is more when you've got things that are clear, so it's pure, it's clear, and then it reaches to the highest level of what it means to be in humanity. So when we're talking about tazkiyah, we're actually looking at learning how to train yourself from leaving the animal akhlaq, the animal mannerisms, to actually reaching the highest level of human mannerisms. And then he says, so the nafs, the inner self, actually starts going from the level of where it's ordering you to practice wrong mannerism to actually taking that gradual transition in where it starts blaming itself and recognizing the faults within the world around it, and then it reaches the final level in where it is content, it is feeling that level of mutma'inna. Mutma'inna is feeling tranquility, is feeling balanced, it's feeling safe, it's feeling happy, and it's definitely going to be that level that the Lord Almighty and the nafs itself will actually feel satisfied with itself, and the Lord Almighty will be content over it. Now, I want you to look at that, because what tazkiyah really is, it's leaving animal mannerism and trying to live up to the divine and malaika and angel mannerisms by simply giving up on a lot of the different things that as human beings, as human beings, of course, this inner feeling of we need to hold on to the quality of life. So many times people will be seeking a degree. And the reason why they're seeking a degree is because, oh, I need to increase my quality of life. I need to probably work on getting better income in order to get a better home, in order to get better control within this life, etc. And without us realizing, many will actually be focused on whether it's seeking a degree, education, wealth, jobs, etc. And all of it is really just to gain a control within this life. But in Islam, the focus is really all about how to gain principle, to live the highest level of what it means to be human. In other words, it's not letting your own animal side control you, but it's actually living the principle of Allah Almighty to control you. Why is tazkiyah important? Well, here's the thing, is that there are negative forces within us and negative forces that surround us. What do we mean by negative forces? Negative forces, whether we're talking about the human beings and what we're surrounded with, and that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us about ourselves. He says, "Inna al-insana khuliqa halu'a, إذا مسه الشر جزوعا." And he talked about generally human beings within themselves. They were actually created as halua, where they seek, in order to seek that survival mode, they would basically try to seek whether property, or seek different ways of authority, or seek any matter that they would feel that is in order to bring about a struggling for survival. And that's a thing, is that then whenever any harm comes their way, just like animals, in where an animal, they would basically seek, struggling for survival, food, drinking, etc., safety, and then إذا مسه الشر جزوعا, and whenever harm comes their way, they will basically fall in despair. But this is not, this is very similar with animals, and where we would want to seek as safety, or to seek safety and seek that moment, how to gain that gain over dunya and control over life, in where we would basically whenever we fall in despair or whenever we fall in hardship, we would go and feel that it's the end, because we would then reconcile to our weaknesses. When our weaknesses and our own abilities fail on us, we would then go into the state of jaza, the state of despair, because we thought that we were in control over the different things that surround us. So that's why we seek money, we seek fame, we seek authority. All those different things are in order to help us feel that we gain control over the different means of survival. And then the different things that also become as those negative forces are the different life outcomes, whether we're talking about the past and the different traumas that we might be victims of, or even the future, where we would be afraid of different things that might happen in the future. So what is tazkiyah related to that? Well, tazkiyah, in where you take a moment to recognize the trauma and your weakness, whether towards the past. And tazkiyah is to change your vision from looking at the trauma to looking at Allah Almighty as the one to compensate you with this trauma, from looking at the future with fear and uncertainty to actually looking through tazkiyah to looking at the Lord Almighty as the one that is in control of your future. So what are you trying to gain in tazkiyah? In tazkiyah, you're trying to gain a different perspective. You're trying to gain a clarity. Remember, tazkiyah is about clarity. You're trying to gain a clarity in your vision as the first center, a clarity in your vision from looking at materialistic things or even the things that you normally see as a human being, a past trauma in the past, to seeing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as the one, the power to control the future and the past, as the power that you would connect to, and as the power that you would actually seek refuge in. So from looking at the things that you want in life to looking at it in the akhirah. So tazkiyah is all about clarity in the vision, from looking at yourself to looking at Allah Almighty, from looking at at time as you are the one in charge of it to actually seeing the powers of Allah Almighty, from looking at the outer motives and seeing the peers and environment, a place of focus to seeing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the akhirah as the place of focus. So what is tazkiyah? Tazkiyah is all about clarity in vision, by also bringing about a clarity and a purity in principle and behavior, a clarity in vision and a principle in behavior. What is the ruling on acquiring tazkiyah? So here's the thing, is that scholars actually had different opinions on answering this question. And the reason why they had differences of opinions is because they actually had differences of opinions on whether we are born not original sin, because in Islam, you're not born with an original sin compared to Christianity, which regarded that Jesus, peace be upon him, according to Christianity, was crucified in order to basically complete the whole idea of original sin. But in Islam, you're not born with original sin. But then they actually had differences of opinions on whether not original sin, but let's call it inner contaminations. What do we mean by inner contaminations? Inner forces within ourselves that are very similar to the inner things that we were created with as part of our own creation, our DNA, and where we're struggling for survival, we're seeking some form some form of um, uh, uh, of um, of stability, etc., without us recognizing those forces that are within us can actually act as those illnesses. So this is, like I said, Al-Ghazali considered, I'm going to go jump to Al-Ghazali. Al-Ghazali actually considered that we are born with certain contaminators, and his evidence was actually based on the hadith that the Prophet ﷺ, remember the hadith where the Prophet ﷺ, according to hadith, and this hadith is actually sahih, that the Prophet ﷺ, in his early childhood, he was playing with the little boys when he was with Halima Sa'diyah. And Halima Sa'diyah did actually later become Muslim and actually say the story herself. She doesn't say the complete part of the story because she doesn't know really what happened. The story goes as follows, okay? The Prophet ﷺ was with Halima Sa'diyah. Halima Sa'diyah was not his mother, but was actually his nursing mother. And at the time, they used to give their children away to basically get a life away from the different pollution. I know it's like pollution. Yes, they considered that the city was full of pollution, and that children were more likely to get ill in the city. So they would send their children in their early childhood away from their parents, away and with the Bedouins, in order to get nursed there, get a better quality of air, quality of basically quality and organic life, let's say. So they would actually send their children off to those Bedouins, and they would give them some money in order to, give those caretakers the compensation for what they're doing. So they Amina, his mother, actually gave the Prophet ﷺ to Halima Sa'diyah. Halima Sa'diyah, she recognized that the children, of course, she sent them off to play, that the children were coming to her, yelling out that the Prophet ﷺ was somehow getting kidnapped by some men that were coming at him. The Prophet ﷺ tells the story from what had happened, that he was a young child at around 4 or 5 years old, and two men came to him in a form of human beings, but they were actually malaika. And they wrestled him, and he tried to wrestle back, even though he was just a child, tried to wrestle back, and then they did an open chest. They opened what is called the open chest, and basically took something out of his chest, and they said that this is the force of what shaitan uses against you. In other words, hadhu shaitani mink. It's like this is what shaitan uses to control people. And then they took it out and washed his heart. So is this something that we will find really in an open heart surgery? No, but this is something that the Prophet ﷺ had told us about, so it's nothing that we would necessarily find in an open heart surgery. So this is part of al-ghaib. And then the Prophet ﷺ later comes to Halima Sa'diyah. Halima Sa'diyah sees him, and she was really concerned. She did see a scar on his chest. She did see that his face had actually changed in color, and she was so afraid and concerned because she didn't want to be held responsible for that. So she basically told his mother, and Halima Sa'diyah herself, when later she had become Muslim in the 8th year Hijrah, she said that she had sent him back to his mother because she recognized that there was a scar on his chest, and she recognized that there was a change in his basically facial color, and she basically said that she had told his mother that it's probably the jinn that were doing something, and she didn't want to be held accountable and responsible for this. So why did I even say the story? I forgot why I was saying the story. Right. So Al Ghazali was actually saying this story, and he said um, just like the Prophet ﷺ was basically going through this. In other words, we are actually born with, let's say, forces or different things that act as this target that shaitan can use against us. And he said, well, this is the evidence that we all have this. So therefore, tazkiyah is basically obligatory on all of us because we are obligated to work against in trying to cleanse our inner self from this type of a force that shaitan will use against us. So the other scholars actually said that no, we are born pure, and tazkiyah is not therefore obligatory on every single person. And their evidence is that the Prophet ﷺ said, كل مولود يولد على الفطرة. The evidence that they had used is that the Prophet ﷺ said, every person is born with a pure innate instinct. Pure innate instinct to mean that you are born natural, you are born pure, you are born with a pure state, and that it is the environment that contaminates it. And that's why they had differences of opinions on tazkiyah. So, how do we actually recognize the two? In the end, is that you, okay, in the end, is that you recognize what the situation is. How do we gain it? Is it something that we gain, or is it something that we are born with that we have to do? So that just remember that piece of it, and just keep it in mind. So what is the preponderant ruling on whether we are obligated or are we not obligated? Ibn al-Jawzi, and I want to say something about Ibn al-Jawzi. We did say something about al-Ghazali, but I would like to say something about Ibn al-Jawzi. Ibn al-Jawzi is actually considered one of the most important scholars. In fact, he and Al Ghazali and Ibn al Qayyim are considered the most important figures to speak about tazkiyah. And he actually wrote a book. It's called Sayd al Khatir. Right there, Sayd al Khatir. All right, Sayd al Khatir. And the book, I believe, is translated, if not fully translated. There are many excerpts that were translated in a number of different books, and I know that there is that compilation of that book as well. So Ibn al-Jawzi, who's actually nicknamed as Abu al-Faraj, all right, he actually used to be a Hanbali scholar. In fact, he is a Hanbali scholar. All right, he's also a scholar of hadith, and he's also a historian. He was born in Baghdad, and that's where he was actually buried as well. And he was very famous for all the different orations that he would give, and specifically about tazkiyah. Now, the name Ibn al-Jawzi, the word al-Jawzi, there are different opinions on why is he called Ibn al-Jawzi. And some scholars actually said that was because within his home he actually had the only tree of walnuts. So he had a walnut tree in his home, and within that city he was the only home that had walnuts. So al-Jawzi is actually related to walnuts. All right. Other scholars said that it wasn't because of walnuts, but it was basically an area that had walnuts, and he was known to live in that area that grew walnuts. So regardless, in the end, regardless of the name, just remember walnuts. Okay. Now Ibn al-Jawzi actually grew up as an orphan. His father died when he was only 3 years old, but his father, being a copper, I don't know what do they call. So I know that a blacksmith is supposed to be a person that deals with steel. I guess a coppersmith. I have no idea. I have no idea if it's called a coppersmith. But anyhow, his father was very wealthy. So he left behind a lot of wealth. And Ibn al-Jawzi actually used that wealth, all right, used that wealth to seek knowledge. So he started acquiring ilm. But Ibn al-Jawzi was an introvert. He was such an introvert that he did not play with children. He did not actually have any friends. He was always to himself. He was such an introvert that he would just take pieces of hardened bread, and he would just go on the river and just sit and just dip that bread in the river and just eat it by himself. So he was eating by himself, sitting with himself. He was constantly just this introvert that just wanted to be by himself. And the way that he gained that, let's call it momentum, all right, momentum of learning about tazkiyah and seeing that is really the moment when he would actually say, he said that he was raised in taraf. He was raised in like a life full of pleasures, a life full of basically he was well off, all right. And he said that whenever I would recognize that if whenever I would gain or engage in the pleasures of dunya, I would recognize that I wasn't capable of reading enough Quran. But whenever I would abstain from the different pleasures of dunya, and what he's calling about pleasures is not something, haram, but he was looking at the different eases in life. So he would say that whenever I would abstain from those eases of life, I would be getting the momentum to read Quran like 5 juz' or even more. So he started recognizing that pleasures and seeking dunya and ease in life is what actually reduced his ability to increase the momentum in gaining tazkiyah. So he would continue in his book writing inside al-Khatir, recognizing what really are the spiritual contaminators and what are the spiritual elevators. So Ibn al-Jawzi said, a wise believer does not let himself loose, but he drives it to the direction it must head to. He lets it loose at times and controls it when it's time to seek discipline. If it disciplines, it will follow gently. But if it is not, it will resist, and then it is your responsibility to force it to the right direction. So very similar, even though Ibn al-Jawzi was, in terms of history-wise, he's pretty much within the era of al-Ghazali, because al-Ghazali died 505 Hijrah and Ibn al-Jawzi actually died 597 Hijrah. Al-Ghazali is Shafi'i madhab, Ibn al-Jawzi is Hanbali madhab. But clearly, during that era, there was, let's call it a number of scholars recognizing that people were taking the religion as if it was just a do and don't, and had the spirit of reviving the faith by looking within. So it's like the door, to open the door is not the handle, is not necessarily to push the handle, but it's actually starting by taking that pull within. It starts from within, and then the door opens up by taking that handle within. It's not pushing, but it's actually opening the door from within. All right. So you could see that there is the similarity between what Ibn al-Jawzi was saying and al-Ghazali was saying, which is an issue of trying to control the leash, just like you would do with basically horseback riding. You can't let it loose, but you need to hold it at times, and you need to basically stretch it or pull it at times and let it loose at times. And that's for you to determine when you recognize what principle you want to direct it to. Abu Zayd, also Abu Zayd al-Bustami, actually said a beautiful quote here. He said, ما زلت أسوق نفسي إلى الله وهي تبكي حتى سقتها وهي تضحك. He said, I drove my nafs, myself, to Allah Almighty while it was crying, until it started laughing when it was driven to Allah Almighty. Beautiful quote. Beautiful quote. It's like while you are working on that tazkiyah, you will find yourself is rejecting, resisting. It doesn't want to. It's just like a child, and where, yeah, you have to eat the right foods and they'll be crying because they don't want to, but you have to force them, because without forcing them to do the right thing, they'll basically not enjoy it. And that's when they'll start enjoying the right foods, enjoying the right things to do, whether it's homework and etc. So having that being said, happiness in tazkiyah is basically our ultimate goal in reaching. Of course, Ibn al-Jawzi said, whoever wanted to purify his situation, then they must purify their action. Why? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَأَن لَوْ اسْتَقَامُوا عَلَى الطَّرِيقَةِ لَأَسْقَيْنَاهُمْ مَاءً غَدَقًا. If they had taken the position or the discipline to work and to be disciplined on the right path, then they would have gained ma'an ghadaqa. They would have gained a lot of pure waters. In other words, we're talking about pure waters. In other words, the different things that they need in life. Important things to learn about tazkiyah. What are we cleansing our heart from? What is the goal of tazkiyah? How do we practice tazkiyah? So those are the questions that we will be answering next week in our second episode, inshallah. So I'd be happy to answer any questions today, inshallah, and inshallah next, well, not this week, but the next following week, inshallah, we'll be answering these questions, and we'll be talking about how do we actually do tazkiyah, how do we do the tahliyah, and how do we do that takhliyah, and what are we cleansing our heart from, how do we get to that goal, and how do we practice it. This is actually one of the most interesting topics. Inshallah, we'll continue it next week or the following week. So if there's anyone that would like to ask any questions, I'd be happy to listen. And Allah yahfadku ya Rab. And if no questions, inshallah, we'll continue the following week. So if I don't know how it works, so I always can't figure it out. So did they raise their hands and then we would allow to talk, or how do we do this? وإياكم. There you go. Ibtihal. Go ahead, Ibtihal. So I think you have to unmute yourself, Ibtihal. I did. There you go.
السلام عليكم، كل سنة وانتم طيبين إن شاء الله.
حبيبة قلبي، الله يسلمك وانت طيبة.
كلهم إن شاء الله. Every other week يعني كل سبت.
So right, it's basically bi-weekly. So every other week, not every week.
Okay, إن شاء الله.
Inshallah.
جزاك الله.
وإياكم. All right. So yeah, it's my favorite topic, and it's so scary for me to actually teach this because, people would usually assume that if you teach it, you had perfected it in terms of yourself, and no matter who you are, you still have to work on your tazkiyah. No matter who you are, even if you're teaching it, you still have to work on it. And many times it's so painful to teach this topic because it will make you feel like you're a hypocrite while you're teaching it, because you know that you have a lot of shortcomings. You know that you have a lot to work on, and it makes me feel horrible teaching this topic really, because it starts feeling, oh my God, I don't know what to say, but it starts just I don't know what to say, but it starts knocking you, and it starts knocking on you, and it's like, you have got shortcomings, why don't you do that? You have to do this, why don't you do it? And it starts becoming this nafs al-lawama, and and ya Allah, I don't know what to say. I hope my words are making sense, but feeling like a hypocrite and feeling and recognizing your shortcomings is not a good feeling at all. Because, as human beings, we want to feel good about ourselves. And when we're talking about tazkiyah, it just puts in that guilt feeling and it doesn't feel good. But we have to remind ourselves every single time about these topics. Because if we don't, then we're never going to improve. So I know, just like you're listening to it and you're feeling bad about yourself, trust me, I'm feeling even worse. I'm feeling even worse and I'm feeling even more guilty than what you would be feeling. It's like, because, when people are looking at you, they would look at you as, oh, mashallah, she must be doing what she's preaching and teaching, and you have your shortcomings. So don't feel that you're the only one here. We're all on the same page. Allah musta'an. And so, inshallah, can we ask for a topic? Yes, you can ask for a topic, but inshallah, we'll be completing the tazkiyah. So, if you have a certain topic that you would like to cover, we can, inshallah, see how we can fit it in, inshallah.
جزاك الله.
وإياكم. All right, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. We'll see you in 2 weeks. Or in 2 weeks? No, after 1 week. All right, Assalamu alaikum. How do you do this?
Recording stopped.